Wherever our trains go, the economy comes to life. Norfolk Southern, one line, infinite possibilities.
Every day, Dominion Lineman Myron Peril helps bring science to life, keeps our waterways healthy, and lifts our spirits by supporting the arts. Because communities run on far more than just electricity. Dominion, what we do every day powers your every day.
It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. At the peak of the 2012 presidential campaign, exactly 11 years after the 9/11 terrorist assaults in New York and Washington, a violent attack began on a U.S. State Department compound in Benghazi, Libya. After a 13-hour fight, the compound was burning and 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, and 2 CIA security contractors, were dead. Allegations swirled that the attack demonstrated a resurgence of al-Qaeda terrorism. Despite the death of Osama bin Laden, there were charges that security for the ambassador had been inadequate or inept. Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was accused of ignoring urgent requests for more security at U.S. facilities in Libya. Many Republicans charged that for political reasons, the White House had misled the American people about the nature of the Benghazi attack. Critics of Hillary Clinton have promised to make Benghazi a central issue in the 2016 presidential campaign should she seek the Democratic Party nomination. Joining us is the best-selling author and journalist Mitch Zukoff, who, with cooperation from 6 CIA security contractors who were in the middle of the fight in Benghazi, has written 13 Hours, the inside account of what really happened in Benghazi. The book, which has been a New York Times #1 bestseller, seeks, amid all the obfuscation and argument around Benghazi, to offer a comprehensive and politically impartial account of what truly happened on that terrible anniversary of September 11.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
So it's 2 years, more than 2 years now, since Benghazi. Mm-hmm. There have been 7 official inquiries of one sort or another into what happened that day, including one from the House Intelligence Committee very recently. Mm-hmm. What's in your inside account that disagrees with any of those 7 reports or isn't a part of them?
Most recently, the House Intelligence Committee report came back and said that there was, for instance, no stand down at the at the CIA annex before the response to the diplomatic community.
No order to stand down.
Correct. Yeah. This is a real conflict between the House Intelligence Committee report and the book. The House Intelligence Committee concludes that there was no order to stand down, that the guys who collaborated with me on the book were not told to stand down and for any reason whatsoever. The guys are very clear that there was a stand down order. They absolutely insist, and one in particular, John Tigan, identified publicly in the book, he was told those words. Bob, the base chief, the CIA base chief in Benghazi, told him to stand down, face to face. The larger points, though, don't conflict that much. There was a delay. These guys were held up from going to the rescue of the ambassador and the other Americans at the diplomatic compound. Whether it was a stand down or it was a tactical decision, which is how it's characterized in the report, is an open question. But the problem with so many of these reports is that they are all partial accounts and that they are all, frankly, political documents to one extent or another. I'd like to say that what they all differ from the book here is that we had no axe to grind. We had no water to carry for anyone. And so as a journalist like you, my goal was getting as close as possible to the ground truth as we could. And so that's the key distinction.
When exactly did you start writing this? I mean, how far after the events?
Almost a year. It was in spring of 2013. I was engaged by the guys. They had stuck together after the attacks. And so some of the reports, the Accountability Review Board from the State Department had already come out with its report. And so there were valuable documents already on the table. But my first goal was to set those aside and talk to these guys one-on-one and try to get their stories. And the Rashomon effect of hearing the different versions and then piecing together something we hope is the truth.
Coincidentally, just a few weeks ago, we had in the same chair here Ambassador Tom Pickering, who co-chaired that first accountability report. And essentially his response was that the most recent report had essentially validated the findings of that original report and a real sense of confidence around a basic set of conclusions that I don't think your book particularly disagrees with, and that is that there was a failure of imagination and planning, and that there should have been better security around these facilities, and sort of an institutional failure on the part of the State Department and others, but not particularly specific to this one incident in those. But that most, if not all, of the other, particularly the allegations that have gotten the most attention, that the White House misled the American people about the cause of the attack, that there had been a stand-down order that had it not been there, lives might have been saved, that were not, that Secretary Clinton, in some specific responsibility way, ignored requests for more security ahead of time, and that in the end, and certainly the House Intelligence Committee report was viewed as a sort of clean bill of health for the administration, the Obama administration. Is that bottom line conclusion that this is a tragedy and there were some institutional mistakes, but the rest of this is just an unfortunate sequence of events? Is that a bottom line correct conclusion?
I think that doesn't go far enough, Doug. I think there are elements of that that are true, but I think there is more to it than that. And now I don't pretend to be an expert on what happened in Washington that night or in the dates prior. We really did focus in on these 13 hours. But the fundamental mistakes were very specific to Benghazi by the State Department. And I think we document them well here. And I think the ARB report did a very good job of showing that as well. But the other points, and staying with the House Intelligence Committee report, I think you know as well as I do, when you have something important to say, you don't release it on Friday night on your website, in the middle of a Thanksgiving holiday weekend. That's not how it's done. So I think that the House Intelligence Committee report and a lot of the other reports are all partial accounts. And I think I'm hopeful, I'm an optimist that the House Select Committee that's underway now, that some people say should never have been impaneled, will in fact get to a larger complete truth.
My sense was, and I try not to be at all partisan or come to these things with presumptions, but my reaction to the most recent report was kind of astonishment that this Republican-dominated committee would come out with such a clean bill of health as it was viewed to be for the Obama administration. After all that has been said, I assumed that the announcing it in the dead of night obscurity, all but that, was simply because it was such an uncomfortable thing for Republicans politically to have to confront that their own committee had arrived at these conclusions. And you're right, a lot of people have said that this ongoing investigation by another congressional committee is purely a political fishing trip. But you take it seriously.
Well, I do. I think by all indications from the first hearing, which I thought was a really remarkably good hearing and well-run hearing and fairly run hearing, I'm going to keep an open mind about it. And I think any close reading or any fair reading of the House Intelligence Committee report is that this is a document designed to protect the CIA and protect the intelligence community. And so while it does indeed try to put to rest some of the political controversies about the Obama administration, about Susan Rice, about Secretary Clinton, et cetera, it is, to me, a transparent effort to absolve the CIA of any responsibility whatsoever. It bends over backwards and it ignores elements that I think are true about what happened there that night in the decision-making process, in the order of business, and the management of the response. And I think I would like to see a final report get to those issues.
I think what's really important about this book and the fact that you wrote it is that you're a real guy. You're not a Fox News contributor. You know.
I've been accused of not being a real guy, so this is really exciting for me.
I say that with a little trepidation. I can't be certain, but as far as I can tell, you're a real guy. You've got a real record as a journalist. You haven't written political books in the past, really. You know, your books have. In fact, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about. I mean, this is something of a departure for you in some respects. But you've worked at the Boston Globe as an investigative reporter. You're finalist for a Pulitzer Prize there in investigative reporting. You're a serious, impartial, dispassionate, as far as I can tell, voice in all of this. And which, by the way, just to quickly ask you this, and then I want you to walk us through that day.
Sure.
The success of the book, it's a wonderfully written, gripping account. There's no doubt it's a book that people will enjoy reading and be informed by. But do you wonder at all, if part of the commercial success of the book, the fact that it raced to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, is because of this large audience of conservative, very, very sort of propaganda-motivated buyers out there who buy every Bill O'Reilly book and every Sean Hannity book, and who assume anything with the word Benghazi on it is a screed against Hillary Clinton. Do you think that you've benefited some from that rush to buy the book?
I'd like to say it's the author photo, but I would be naive or disingenuous if I didn't agree to some extent, certainly. The audience was primed to find out, and I think it was genuine, though, beyond that particular audience because of what happened with 60 Minutes and what happened with the previous book that had been withdrawn. And so people had heard all kinds of stories they claimed to be, and then when they heard that the actual guys, and they were identifying themselves for the first time in this book, and that maybe that it was written by a real guy, I think they felt, I'd like to think the audience the base was there, but I'd like to think we moved beyond it.
Yeah. And some of those folks have probably been unhappy with your book, too. I mean, people who wanted it to be a condemnation.
I have heard those comments. Yes.
Well, so take us through that day,
Sure.
the basics of the story, and not necessarily all six of your guys, but who were the key characters
Sure.
and the key sequence of events that's revealed through what they told you?
Happy to. The day really begins just at dawn, when at the temporary there are two compounds, as we know, in Benghazi. One is the diplomatic compound, and less than a mile away is the CIA annex, the second compound for our intelligence community. And the diplomatic compound was actually very quiet normally, but at this time the ambassador is there, and he has a communications specialist, Sean Smith, and 5 diplomatic security guards, DS agents. And the day begins at dawn with something unusual. It is September 11th, 2012. The ambassador is planning to spend the entire day inside the walls for security, for safety reasons.
And just not to interrupt, but he's also just arrived, right?
Correct.
The night before.
He is normally in Tripoli, but he is there for a 5-day visit for a variety of duties. And so the day begins with one of the local guards who's employed by the diplomatic security staff noticing that there is someone in a Libyan policeman's uniform taking photographs and video from an abandoned building or a building under construction across. They can look over the wall into the entire diplomatic compound. And this guard, this intrepid Libyan guard, goes and confronts this person who just leaves and takes his video with him. So I think it's pretty clear that is either surveillance or reconnaissance. That's not a random act on the morning of September 11th. Ambassador Stevens goes about his day, has a number of meetings, also tries to file a report complaining about this photographer and the lack of security from the Libyan police department that had been promised. The day is quiet otherwise. There are no protests in Benghazi, unlike what's happening in Cairo, where there are protests about a video and elsewhere. And everyone's sort of hunkering down for the night. Now, over at the annex, two of the guys are driving around the city, scoping out where the ambassador is going to go the next day, and they notice also it's completely quiet. The ambassador is able to walk outside the walls to say goodnight to his last guest, a Turkish envoy. He's in his room, he's settling down. Sean Smith is in the villa, the main building, and the 5 diplomatic security agents are spread around. One happens to be in the operations center doing paperwork, 3 are by the pool, and 1 is inside the villa watching television. At 9:42, although that time is somewhat in dispute, but for argument's sake, 9:42, the person who is inside the TOC, the Alec Henderson, the diplomatic security agency agent, looks up, hears a noise, and sees on the video monitor 24 men with AK-47s, 2 carrying banners, rushing through the front gates of the diplomatic compound. He hits the drop and cover alarm, but almost immediately the 5 diplomatic security agents are separated into 3 buildings because they are not armed. They only have their sidearms. They have to run back to get their armor, their long guns, their night vision goggles. And the ambassador and Sean Smith are in their room with the one diplomatic security agent who is the body man, Scott Wickland. And he gets them into a safe haven, a locked area inside this diplomatic compound. Tragically, though, the attackers, in addition to firing off their weapons, they grab kerosene, jerry cans of kerosene, and they start setting fire to the buildings. And they blow open the diplomatic villa, and they set fire in there, they set fire outside, they set fire to vehicles. And it so happens that, and this is one of the failures of the State Department, this was not up at the level of a consulate or an embassy in terms of its security posture. And so there are no fire suppressant devices, and there is inadequate security in that sense. And so choking diesel fumes start to fill this diplomatic villa. As this is happening, the call goes out almost immediately to the men who I worked with. These guys are called GRS, the Global Response Staff. In the wake of 9/11, the CIA realized it needed special security teams to protect its case officers around the world, especially in places like Benghazi. And so the GRS team, the operators, as they're known, are mustered to respond.
As we go into this, I want to make sure we've also laid out that in addition to this description you've given of the compound, is a sense of how the security worked at a facility like this. Because I think that we generally have this view that at a U.S. embassy, that the security is handled by the Marines who are at the front gate, and we know that there are CIA people in almost every embassy too, and we assume they probably have some manner of defending themselves. But the situation here was that there are the guys you worked with who are all ex-military, but are private contractors to this service you just described. But their supervisor is a CIA employee, and then there's a CIA station chief who's sort of ultimately in command of them. There's also a diplomatic security group that are employees of the State Department.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah. And but then also there's an arrangement with a local militia, supposedly less hostile to the United States. They're supposed to have guards, even though a couple of them, according to some of your guys, had actually tried to shake them down or attack them not that much earlier. And then there are supposed to be local police, and those are the folks who just hadn't shown up that day. And that's what the ambassador was. In fact, it may have been a local policeman who was shooting the video. Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So it's a sort of bafflingly chaotic
Indeed.
arrangement. And the building itself is not really a secure building. It's not made of the kind of materials that an embassy would be. The walls are not as strong. So we really have a house, a nice house.
That's right.
Surrounded by a handful of employees of the United States government, a handful of private contractors, and maybe some friendly locals.
And maybe friendly.
Yeah.
Not entirely
maybe
friendly.
some maybe friendly
Correct.
locals. Right.
Correct. And even the militia that the 17 February Martyrs Brigade, that's supposed to be somewhat more friendly, is at this moment on a work stoppage against the Americans over a pay dispute. So while we're perhaps hoping that they're going to come to respond to an incident like this, they were at the same time refusing to accompany the ambassador as he traveled through the streets of Benghazi in daylight hours normally. So I think expecting them to respond to a live fire event was naive at best.
So your guys get the call.
Yes. They get the call, and they, in their parlance, they jock up. They immediately get their long guns, their armor, their night vision goggles, and they assemble 2 armored vehicles that they are ready to go. And they're ready to go immediately, and they're heated up, and they are concerned because they feel that the longer they wait, the more their enemies will they be able to seize the initiative. And the harder it will be, and the more dangerous it will be even for them. They're concerned about the ambassador and their fellow Americans, but they're also concerned about themselves. And so the minutes are ticking by, and multiple times, by their account, and it's not disputed anywhere, they approach, and this is actually shown on the drone video as well, I'm told, they approach Bob, the base chief, and say, we gotta go, we're losing the initiative. And they're hearing calls from the ambassador's staff, the diplomatic security agents, we're taking fire, we're under fire. And finally, one comes over and says, if you guys don't get here, we're going to die. And according to my sources on the record, they violate command. They do something they had never done in their military careers. They break the order and they say, we're going now. And they rush out of the gate, they drive through the gate, and they go and try and, because of the time that's gone by, the Ansar al-Sharia, or the other enemies who have taken the diplomatic compound, have hardened their defenses, and so they have to leave their cars some 400 yards away and work on foot to the diplomatic compound.
And when they get to the compound, what do they find?
They get outside the gate, and they don't know what's happening inside. It's dark. Buildings are on fire. There are men running around with AK-47s.
And how many of them are there? Remind us.
And at this point, in the front gate, there are only 3 of our guys. You mean of our guys? Yeah, there are 3, and there are another 2 who are going around the back way. But the first to arrive are led by Roan, and John Tigan and Jack Silva are the other 2 with him at that moment. And John Tigan, calls over to back to the annex and says, we're going in. And Tyrone Woods takes that as a signal. He jumps up from behind a concrete barrier and wheels through the front gate of the diplomatic compound with a lone man, not knowing what he's going to encounter, because he knows the ambassador and 6 other Americans are in there. And I stop sometimes and think about that kind of heroism, that kind of bravery. And what they find when his fellow Americans follow him in from both sides is a destroyed compound. Fortunately, the attackers have fallen back because they can't get to the ambassador, it seems, and they've set their fires, and now they're regrouping. And they go in, they plunge again and again into the villa, trying to find the ambassador and Sean Smith. And they're going through smoke. They have no protective equipment. It is completely dark, filled with smoke, noxious fumes. And they're unable to find the ambassador. They do, with the help of the DS agents who they have now collected, they do find Sean Smith. Tragically, he's gone. As they're trying to go back in again and again more for the ambassador, their enemies come back. They start taking rocket-propelled grenade fire, AK-47 fire, and they muster on the roof of the villa, and John Tigan takes out a man with an RPG as he's about to fire into another one into the villa. And they fight back, and they repel their enemies once more and decide we can't stay here any longer. And so they take Sean Smith's body, and first they send the diplomatic security guards out. They wait behind. They make sure they're the last to leave. And they take Sean's body, and they go back to the annex, still taking fire as they leave.
And where is Ambassador Stevens?
At this point, they don't know, but we later find out that he is still trapped, almost certainly dead from smoke inhalation, inside the locked safe haven, deep inside the villa.
And now we've got this sort of second battle unfolding. That's really
Correct.
the main battle in a sense.
Yes.
And the contractors make their way back to the separate facility that's not very far away, which
Yes.
is where they usually are.
Exactly. And that's a more hardened facility. That is, they have made sure that this place is not a soft target. And so they have fighting positions already laid out. They get onto roofs where they already have weapons and ammunition. And while the DS agents and virtually everyone else, there are a couple of DS agents who help, actually 3 in the end, but they, again, these same guys, take up these defensive positions knowing that this is hardly over. And then there begin a series of battles throughout the night. They start with a group of men coming through the dark from an area the guys call Zombieland, and from a house that they know was kind of hostile to the Americans, and they repel that. And they're up there, and they're waiting, calling for help, hoping for help, and it, of course, doesn't come. And the second battle involves dropping and throwing gelatina bombs. What fishermen in Libya use to blow the fish up and help catch fish. And they were the fish. The Americans were the fish at this moment. And so, and the second attack also has a rocket-propelled grenade that fires over the annex. And so it's really a story of 13 endless hours of battle. It culminates when a group of other GRS agents, officials, arrive from Tripoli with 2 active duty Delta Force members. And they make it to the annex, and we're going to evacuate you. All of them go inside the main building except for one, Glenn Doherty, who's a GRS agent who's a close friend of Tyrone Woods, and he goes up on the roof to see Tyrone Woods. And almost at the same time he reaches there, they have a brief interchange, and mortars start being fired. It's a siege weapon, as you know. And so you can fire them from far away, and they start landing very close to the roof where the men are, and then on top of the roof. And this leads to the 2 more deaths, the deaths of Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty, and the terrible injuries to one DS agent, Dave Ubin, and Mark Geist, Oz, one of the GRS guys, one of the guys I worked very closely with. And this is really the worst of the worst. And the guys on the other roofs keep firing and keep fighting. And fortunately, the attack does not lead to a ground assault, which is what they feared, and they are able to evacuate and get to the airport, where they are relinked with Ambassador Stevens' body, which has now been recovered.
Yeah, it's a harrowing story and a harrowing account of man-to-man battle. I mean, the most gruesome kind of fighting. This key question, though, of whether lives might have been saved that were not, or that things might have gone differently had there been a different sequence of actions, and that comes right back to what you referred to of your guys being ready to move, and the CIA station chief making a decision or telling them not to. That seems to be perhaps the single most disputed fact in the whole sequence of events. But first, how important was that? I mean, if things had gone exactly the way that the Annex team thought they should go, well, then what might have happened differently?
Well, because of the initial delay and the fact that their enemies had been able to harden their defenses, the delay was doubled. So it wasn't just the delay leaving the annex, it was the delay then having to slowly move to get into the diplomatic facility. So that's a 40-minute, a 45, perhaps more minute delay. I can only rely on what the guys believe, and I know they believe this in their hearts. They believe they would have gotten there within 10 or so minutes, and they believe they would have had a very strong chance of saving the ambassador and Sean Smith. And I think there's credibility to that. And I understand the other side, that we're all guessing and it's all hindsight, but they in their hearts are certain that these guys died of smoke inhalation. They didn't die of a bullet wound that we don't know when it was administered. Smoke inhalation takes a while. We know from Scott Wicklund, the DS agent who was with them, that the ambassador and Sean Smith were with him for quite some time before he was separated from them. They were in a bathroom, they were wetting towels, they were trying to keep the smoke out. They were struggling for their lives. And even if they had been unconscious, or even if they had been suffering from it, time is of the essence when you're dealing with smoke. And so I do know that these guys are certain they would have saved the 2.
Have you ever been at the scene of a car accident?
I have.
Yeah. My experience, I have too. My experience is that it's human nature, I think, that if you're at the scene of a car accident, some other terrible thing, you dial 911, If the ambulance and the police arrive in 1 minute, if they arrive in 20 minutes, no matter how long it takes, you're certain it took far too long. They should have been here sooner. Things could have been different. And it seems that that's just a human impulse.
Yes.
Do you worry at all about that because everybody wants the car wreck not to have happened, these guys want these events not to have happened? Does that color whether that's really a fair assessment?
It's a great question, and I think, I hope you agree, in the way I've written the book, we can't make any hard and fast conclusions. I report what the guys truly believe, and I think readers can see that this is the sincere belief of a man who dedicated his life and risked his life multiple times to prevent just that very thing from happening. But absolutely, there's no way to know for sure, and of course it must have felt like not 10 minutes or a half hour or 45 minutes, but hours. Each minute, each second ticking by as you're sitting in a car waiting to go, knowing that there are Americans under attack, must have been excruciating. And so I'm sure those are more intense memories for them because of it. And yet, having said that, and I never reach a conclusion in the book, I'm answering the question of, would it be possible? I think it's a reasonable argument to make that it may have been possible. I do believe that.
And the relationship between these guys, the contractors, and the CIA station chief, who did not talk to you, right?
Correct. Yeah. I tried multiple times.
And he has he made public statements about any of this? But there was not a particularly wonderful relationship between these guys and that person to begin with.
No.
Why was that?
Well, there's a number of reasons. One, they felt as though he treated them like Walmart security guards, as in their phrase, and they didn't value their training, their expertise. They collectively had over a century of military and contracting experience, but they were not CIA staff, they were not agency people, and so that's how they felt he treated them. But there was more to that. Also, earlier in the summer, there was this incident that completely turned off the guys to him. Tyrone Woods, and another contractor had gone from the annex to the airport to fetch a cache of supplies that had just come in. On their way back, they're held up by a hostile militia. And they are held at gunpoint, effectively. And they radio back, hey, we're in trouble here. We could use some backup. And Bob, the base chief, refused to allow the other guys to go and help Roan. And he may have had valid reasons. When you're running a CIA base, you don't want to spend a lot of time calling attention to it. I get that. But for the guys, he was saying, we're going to call out the 17th February militia. They'll go help Roan. They never come. The 17th militia never follows up. And so at that moment, the guys already felt as though he didn't care what happened to Roan and the other operator at that moment. And so a bad relationship became worse. And then when the night comes of the attack, and they're hearing Bob saying again, that he's going to call out 17 February, they're incredulous. They say, wait a second, they didn't respond when Roan was under fire, was at gunpoint. They won't accompany the ambassador around town on daytime trips, and we think they're going to come now? Are you crazy? So it was a very bad relationship.
So how did the dispute develop of that your guys are so certain that they're explicitly told stand down, don't do it, don't go, and all of these other official accounts say that in fact that didn't happen?
Yeah, I think I don't want to reduce it to semantics. But because the word stand down became so politically fraught, because there were allegations of other stand downs, there were allegations disproven, or at least so far completely not proven, that there was a stand down of the military, and there was a stand down of some group that was perhaps at Sigonella in Italy or elsewhere, those particular words carried extra weight. And so in the report, and certainly the CIA base chief acknowledges, there was a delay. There was a wait command. Whether the actual words stand down were issued has extra meaning right now because of all the other context. So I don't think the disagreement is much more than John Tigan will swear on a stack of Bibles. He was told to stand down. He did not have an opportunity to share that, and instead the base chief apparently testified he just told them to wait.
And do your guys, do they accept the possibility that that whatever the order was, whatever the intent was, that it's possible that it actually was a well-considered one, that the CIA chief had a good basis for saying, don't go right now?
They were open to the possibility that it was not nefarious, but they feel as though he was wholly ill-equipped to be making these calls. He was not a military leader. He was an intelligence officer, a career intelligence officer. And he was not someone who was familiar with or experienced on the ground with military action. And so when they, all of whom have been in battle, two of them are former Navy SEALs, you have Army Ranger, you have Marines, Army Sniper, they felt as though he had no idea what he was doing. So I don't think they would go as far as to say it was a reasonably considered action. It was not necessarily an ill-considered or nefarious, but he had no business making that call.
It was just wrong.
Right.
Just the wrong
Better
call.
put, yes.
Yeah. But the one thing that's clear in all of this is that we're having a kind of fog of war conversation.
Indeed.
That in the midst of all this confusion, that your guys are pretty convinced that this commander made a bad decision and it had some consequences. And that commander apparently thinks that he made a defensible decision. But there's nowhere in any of this is there the suggestion that he picked up the phone and Hillary Clinton said, stand down.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
And the idea that, as has been offered up by some people, that somehow all of this had to do with a really elaborate conspiracy in which Ambassador Stevens was actually trying to funnel weapons to certain people in Libya, and that the White House actually wanted Stevens to be dead. I mean, these kinds of things have been said.
I've heard them all. I've heard them all.
Yeah.
And
is there anything to any of that?
I get calls at night, people saying, "You want to know the real story?" So I'm used to that. None of that. And the guys, and that's why I was very clear when I wrote this book. We're going to stay close to the ground. We're going to stay as close to the truth, and it's going to be a journalistically defensible exercise. And so there's no room for that because there's no evidence of those things. And none of the guys has any, will ever publicly or even I think privately suggest any of those conspiracy theories to be the case.
We seem to have a kind of fascination in American life now with the first-hand account, and that is that's matched up with a real fascination we have with these kind of superhero soldiers that we've all come to accept what our soldiers, because they appear to be that.
Yes.
These guys, that your 5 guys can take on this whole thing that's happening at the compound and get inside and actually accomplish some things and then get back out alive. It's straight out of the movies, and I assume this is going to be a movie. But
it is.
Yeah,
it's underway. I think filming in March.
Yeah, there we go. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
But we have this idea of our soldiers, including our ex-soldiers who are now working for us as private contractors, that they have these almost supernatural kinds of abilities, and they really do seem to have them. And so we're fascinated with them, with this personality at a time where there doesn't seem to be enough leadership and there's so much disagreement in our society. We like these guys who are so decisive and they just go in and kill those bad guys, and then they come back out again, most of them. And we also have this fascination with the first-hand account. We've seen the same thing around the books that are coming out around the killing of Osama bin Laden.
Noisy Day.
Yeah, exactly. All these things.
Yeah.
But we also know, if we step back from that first-hand account, eyewitness testimony is one of the most unreliable forms of testimony
Indeed.
there is. And that people who are on the ground and don't actually know what the big considerations are far away, whose job is not to know them, oftentimes really have a skewed perspective on why things are happening the way they're happening. But what do you make of that? I mean, are these accounts as reliable as one would assume they must be?
I can only speak for this account, and so I took that into consideration, and in very strong consideration. And I wouldn't have put my name on the book if I felt as though this was going to be simply hagiography of these guys and making them just heroes. They don't know what's happening in Washington or in Tripoli or in the Mediterranean, but they do know what's happening to them on the ground in the moment. And that was important to record for history. You're right about the superhero thing. I got it. The first time I met these guys as a group, and we're in a bar together, I'm just hoping that somebody causes trouble. You know, I'm like, where are those mean bikers now? You know, like I'm with these guys. So, and they are every bit of that. And so, then I separate them, and I want them to be as authentic as possible and tell me what they know and what they don't know, and not be drinking out of the same cup, where if you put them all in the same room, they might say, oh yeah, right, sure, I remember that. And that's just human nature, to confirm each other's accounts, because they care about each other. So I took as much precaution as I could. And as I say in the preface to this book, I do not expect this to be the final word by any account. But it is the first word, and the first authentic word from the ground view. And I think that, yes, eyewitness testimony, as we've seen, it can frequently in trials proves unreliable, and then DNA comes back and tells us other. But as reporters, we still have to get that firsthand account. We have to tell that eyewitness story as well and as clearly and as carefully as we can. And that was really the mission of this book.
One other area of primary dispute, particularly in the more political discussion, I just want to hear what conclusions, if any, you arrived at. There were these protests happening the night before in Cairo that were clearly related to this amateurish film made by an Egyptian American that slandered, I think you said defamed, actually. You stated it as a fact in the book that it defamed the great prophet. And that led to these protests in Cairo, and then eventually what happened in Benghazi was ascribed variously, but generally in the beginning, as having begun as a protest like that, but that then was taken advantage of by bad people or morphed into something else. Clearly, you describe an organized and deliberate attack, not something that began as a protest, but not necessarily what's within the confines of the book. But what's your view on that whole question?
Sure. I found CIA Assistant Director Mike Morell's, Deputy Director Morell's testimony enlightening there. And I learned a lot about how they reached that decision to put that in the talking points.
And what Morell said, just we're clear,
Please.
and relatively recently testified to this again, I think, that there was no political consideration to alter these talking points that went up to ultimately to the White House. He said that he was unaware that they even were going to the White House, and that there were these multiple media reports and other things that came in that said that this was what it was, and that security analysts legitimately believed that the film protest was an element of what had happened.
Yes, and I believe that there's nothing to contradict that on the record. From the guys' perspective, they were very frustrated because they knew, from what they experienced and saw, there were no protests. They had heard nothing of this film. They knew it was categorically different than what was happening in Tunisia or in Cairo and elsewhere. And so the talk of the film frustrated them, and that it did, frankly, make them wonder, were there political considerations involved? Why were they talking about this film? If they had asked us, we could have told them that night. There were no protests in Benghazi. We were driving on the streets that night. But they also understand that, especially after Morell's testimony and after other things that have come out, that it doesn't, the fact that it was included doesn't automatically prove a conspiracy. So in terms of the video, I think it's really unfortunate that so much attention was paid to that and to what happened in the talking points on the Sunday morning talk shows, that for months and months we ignored the 3 months before September 11th and all the mistakes and all the real issues that I think should have been the conversation. And so I think that's where I come out.
But clearly, from their perspective and yours, based on it, that clearly the movie was not, the idea that this began as a protest, there's no foundation to that.
Well, there's just one other piece that goes beyond the guys. I respect the reporting of David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times. And David Kirkpatrick did some very good on-the-ground reporting, and his story ran in December of 2013. And in which he found some people who apparently were part of the attack, or Abu Khatala, for instance, who's now in custody, awaiting trial for these events, suggested that they were aware Some people suggest they knew about the video. Even if there wasn't a protest, they were aware that people were protesting elsewhere, if not in Benghazi. And so I keep an open mind on that. I can't say it had no, I can't say categorically it had no influence whatsoever, because I do respect his reporting. And so was it the final straw? Was it the match that lit the tinder? I can't say. But I can't, because I respect Kirkpatrick, and I read that story obviously very closely. I've spoken with Kirkpatrick.
And he still sticks to it.
He does.
His view hasn't changed.
His view has not changed because of the people he spoke to, and he found them credible, that they were distinctly aware of it. Although if you read, I know you have, read his story closely, he's not saying it was the sole motivating factor.
He says it's more complicated than either version of events.
Then I have to keep that open mind, and that's why I'm hoping the trial will clear that up for us.
The one thing that seems abundantly clear through all of this, and that we could have stopped the whole conversation 30 minutes ago probably, at just the description of the compound and who was there and who had responsibility, and just said, is this any way to run a war or run an army? And so the idea that there was a gigantic institutional failure around the strategy and imagination for security around really important people like Chris Stevens, who we really haven't talked about, but who was a very, very remarkable person, and a career Foreign Service officer who had a particular attitude toward and a willingness to go into these dangerous places and do dangerous things and connect to the people. I mean, he was exactly the kind of Foreign Service officer that whose point of view was completely missing from the debacle in Iraq in so many ways. And so the tragedy that such an important person's life is lost here, and that it was a result of some sort of institutional failure, that's abundantly clear.
Yes.
But the rest of the story is it is so difficult to land in a place where you can really say that there's a policy change that ought to be pulled out of this, or that there's some very, in the end, it does seem to be a fog of war story, and people are confused about exactly what happened. And even when you nail it all down, it's still a little fuzzy. But and the idea that a confused account of things made its way to the White House and made its way on to Meet the Press, I mean, it all sounds pretty reasonable in the end, or no?
I'm not quite ready to go to reasonable, Doug. I don't want to lose sight, and I know you're not in your question, of those months prior, the number of mistakes and the levels at which the mistakes were made at the State Department, allowing them to be in that situation, denying the request that Ambassador Stevens had made for a site security team to remain in Libya with him through the summer. The fact that we had something called a temporary mission compound, which doesn't exist. There is no such thing on the books. It's just a made-up name that allows it to be less secure than a consulate, which has to have a hardened facility, or an embassy. We can't lose sight of those things. We can't lose sight of the decisions that when the Brits pull out, and we don't pull out in June of 2012, when bombs are blowing open walls on the American compound, and we don't really change the security posture. So all the mistakes beforehand, and then the mistakes that night, where you do have only 7 lightly armed diplomatic security agents with an ambassador, where you don't have a Marine team, like as you said earlier, where you have CIA intelligence officers acting in the role of military commanders on sort of on the fly, having to figure out how to respond to a military incursion against an American base.
And who in this case don't really have any particular military background.
Precisely. And so I think there are lessons beyond, that we need to study what happened that night that I hope can keep our people safe in the other 275 places around the world where we place them doing our business.
Your guys, who you worked with on the book, I mean, they are by definition kind of super patriots. That comes through in every level. Yes. Irrational patriots, maybe even. One of them you describe has a tattoo on his chest that is an image that makes it appear that his skin is being peeled back, and beneath the skin is an American flag.
That's Tonto.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's an astonishing image.
It's an astonishing tattoo. I would like to show it to you. I'm sorry. Your audience would appreciate that.
So these guys are hardcore patriots. There's no doubt about that. They're incredibly brave. They'd risked their lives previous occasions. They're all ex-military, but they also had made a decision, apparently because they could take better care of their families, really, to get out of the military and get into doing this as private work. What would they say about this question of, is this the way things ought to be done? Would they say it ought to be the work ought to be given to private contractors like us, or would it be better to have real active duty soldiers who are operating not in a commercial transaction, but out of their vow as members of the American military?
I think they would find, or try to find, a middle ground between those two, where they would say, and Mark Geist has created something called the Shadow Warriors Foundation for contractors, that contractors, if we're going to use them, I mean, if we don't have a binary choice of yes or no, we're going to use them. That is the reality on the ground. We have to treat them better. We have to pay them fairly, which perhaps we do, but we also have to make sure that they are cared for afterward. You may have seen the reports about Glenn Doherty's family now having to sue the government over insurance, that he was given the wrong insurance policy and that he had to pay for himself. That ultimately did not result in a death benefit because he had no immediate survivors. He was not married and had no children. They are not treated well. They are treated as disposable. And so I think their position, their answer to that would be, if you're going to use us, at least treat us appropriately and not as, as tissues to be thrown away afterward.
There are policy considerations here. That the 3 months prior to these events can't be forgotten, as you said, and really probably the 3 years before, and that Ambassador Stevens did on more than one occasion ask for more support. And there has been a question of how far did any of those requests go up through the chain of command in the State Department. But in the end, what has been maintained is that was beneath the work of a Secretary of State, and so in the end, Hillary Clinton is not directly tied to all of that. But what do you make of that? Is that a fair thing to say, that there are big questions that need to be resolved institutionally, but do they or don't they really relate to who the Secretary of State was at the time?
I think, again, I'm not trying to split hairs here, but I feel as though we can both agree that she may have not had any direct operational involvement in any of those decisions. And yet, when you are the CEO of a business, when you are the secretary, you are responsible. And she, even in her book, in the chapter she devotes to Benghazi, she says, I'm responsible for everyone in the State Department, and I never felt that responsibility more than I did that night. So it seems to me that's it's an artful way of phrasing it. But I read that as she is taking responsibility, and she should take responsibility, because if you are the Secretary of State and you have been the Secretary of State for a number of years, she didn't just arrive in that position, then the people who are in the positions beneath you, who are making those decisions, ultimately are your employees.
At the time that this was happening, I said to people, I was reporting a little bit still on the 2012 campaign, and my observation to others at the time was that, particularly at the very peak moment of the first substantive revelations that there had been a request for additional security, my reaction, just as a political analyst at the time, was that if Hillary Clinton had not been so critical to the re-election strategy of President Obama, that almost any other Secretary of State would have had to resign at the time, whether it was truly merited or not.
I'm talking about sort of realpolitik here. That is what you just described is exactly how the real world works. And I think the Secretary has been unfairly blamed throughout this process for a lot of things she had nothing to do with. And a lot of the accusations and a lot of the conspiracy theories were ridiculous, scurrilous, and worse. But just as you say, there were political considerations that helped to protect her, that might not have protected a John Kerry or a Madeleine Albright in the same circumstances.
So the case is not closed.
We're still selling books.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Mitch Sukoff, the book is 13 Hours, the inside account of what really happened in Benghazi.
It's great. Thank you.
Wherever our trains go, the economy comes to life. Norfolk Southern, one line, infinite possibilities.
Every day, Dominion Lineman Myron Peril helps bring science to life, keeps our waterways healthy, and lifts our spirits by supporting the arts. Because communities run on far more than just electricity. Dominion, what we do every day powers your every day.